and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, a carbon tax back on the agenda. Will the government risk it? Julia Gillard's big plans for the first week of Parliament next week. And should pensioners be forced to pay full fare on public transport during peak hour? Our panel tonight, ABC Online's chief political writer, Annabel Crabb, New South Wales Greens MP, Cate Faermann, and in Melbourne, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs. First up tonight, the Speaker stalemate continues. The major parties are still slugging it out over changes to the role, and we're no closer to finding out who's likely to be nominated. Despite earlier agreeing to a deal on pairing with the independents, the opposition now says that was in breach of the Constitution.
The coalition cannot accept the proposed arrangement for the pairing of the Speaker because, after careful consideration of the matter, we believe that it is constitutionally unsound. We've carefully looked at the Solicitor General's opinion, and it's clear from a close reading of the Solicitor General's opinion that the only basis on which the Speaker can be paired is an informal arrangement. Now, the government of the country, legislation that passes the Parliament, is too important to be based on an informal arrangement.
But the Prime Minister says Tony Abbott has broken his word.
Mr Abbott has indicated to me that whilst, of course, he and his political party agreed with parliamentary reform, he does not intend to honour that section of the agreement that has the Speaker paired. Mr Abbott has indicated to me that he intends to break his word. Having given his word, having had his political party give its word, having entered an agreement in writing, having publicly verified on a number of occasions that he intends to honour the agreement, he now intends to break his word.
Annabel, why is Tony Abbott breaking this part of the agreement?
Because it's worth an extra vote to him. And it's a pretty valuable extra vote. Any opposition in this situation would far rather deal with the government that has 75 votes as opposed to the opposition's 74. Much rather do that than deal with a government that has 76 votes. And that's as simple. It's a pretty simple equation.
So it plays into his hands of a government seeming chaotic and not being able to pass legislation?
Well, it just means that they're one vote closer to being able to pass their own legislation, to be able to frustrate the government's agenda. And effectively, what Tony Abbott had in front of him over the last couple of days is a choice about whether to give the government an extra vote, give it the wiggle room, and he's made the decision not to. I don't think that's... Look, it's not surprising given what we know about the way Tony Abbott prosecutes the business of being an opposition. He's a pretty muscular opposition leader, and he has decided to take this course of action. He's not going to give the government any refuge at all over the course of this term of this minority government. Now, he appended his name to that agreement. I mean, the funniest thing about this whole exchange, and, it's occasioned a huge amount of kind of legalistic documents and analysis. It's allowed the Shadow Attorney General, George Brandis, to write about a 6-page opinion with much use of Latin terms, which is an excellent development for Senator Brandis. He enjoys doing that. But this is Tony Abbott saying, in effect, this is a sort of a gentleman's agreement, and I can't be a party to legislation that's, passed on the basis only of an informal agreement. But the informal agreement is with him, effectively. So what he's saying is, I can't possibly be trusted to sustain this agreement in a constitutionally viable way.
Chris Berg, what did you think of the interpretation of the Solicitor General's advice made by Tony Abbott then today?
Well, I think it reveals Tony Abbott's strategy pretty clearly. As Annabel said, he's going into this. I mean, this is a belligerent strategy. He's decided instead of playing ball with the government, he's going to fight it. He's going to be the Tony Abbott that was so successful for the last 12 months since he won the election. He's going to undermine them as much as possible. What it also shows is that the idea that they might switch horses midstream, the independents might swap over to the coalition, that's not going to fly anymore. If I was listening to an interview with Tony Windsor just today, and Tony Windsor's not very happy about this. Rob Oakeshot's not going to be very happy about this. I don't think the coalition is going to get the independents. That was always a real long shot from what they've said, but you can see this is Tony Abbott's plan to force the government back into an election within 18 months or so. I don't think they want to go to an election too soon, but I think it's pretty clear that Tony Abbott does not want to see a 3-year opposition term, probably because he's a little bit worried about how that might hold his position within the Liberal Party itself.
Cate, is this a smart strategy on behalf of Tony Abbott?
I don't know whether it's a smart strategy. What we're seeing with Tony Abbott, I think, is he's being a wrecker here. I agree with Chris. He clearly does want to send the electorate back. He wants to have an election in 18 months. Surely Tony Abbott got legal advice on this when he signed that agreement on September the 6th. Surely he had legal advice at that time.
Well, Christopher Pyne says that he was assuming that Anthony Albanese had done that.
Right.
I thought you were picking up the bill. I thought you were. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think Tony Abbott is absolutely trying to be a wrecker with this process, and I think the majority of Australians now are keen for a government, a stable government, to get on with the job. I think they're also excited about a minority government. I think they're excited about what they're going to see. And, Parliament resumes next week. I think Tony Abbott needs to get back into his role as opposition leader and, face facts that he is now opposition leader and get on with it.
Is everyone excited by a minority government? A lot of people think that, that means that the big issues won't be tackled, that some pieces of legislation just simply won't even be tested before the Parliament.
I think what we'll see with a minority government, actually, is that a lot of pieces of legislation will come through and get considered debate, rather than, it all being the Labor Party's agenda. We're seeing that with the carbon tax, like how...
we need to get a speaker first, though. We can't even get that far.
We do need to get a speaker first.
It's a bit of a good indicator of how quickly we're going to
Chris Berg, you wanted to come in there?
Stuff.
I did, because I find this accusation that Tony Abbott's being a wrecker kind of odd, because Tony Abbott is completely allowed to be a wrecker as an opposition leader. If you think that's a good strategy, if you think that might win you votes in the election coming up, then wrecking works. I mean, Tony Abbott nearly won an election on wrecking, and take it from his perspective.
Didn't quite, though.
The coalition have been making a lot of arguments that, they will be a better government, but not only that they'll be a better government, but it's the moral thing to do. They're concerned in their own view that people are dying on the seas because of Labor's own policies. Now, I'm not convinced that's the case, but if you believe that, if you are a politician who thinks that people are dying because of the current government, you are morally obliged to be a wrecker. You have to take these guys.
Cate, on that issue of wrecking, some people might say the Greens are wreckers, that they didn't pass an ETS.
Well, they're now looking at a carbon tax, and I think that is going to be a much better thing for climate change in this country. We saw that with the ETS, the CPRS, we saw big business get all over that to the point that it wasn't actually going to reduce emissions to any way that was effective, and that's the point. I think, this is a good step forward in terms of a carbon tax. Now, Tony Abbott absolutely is a wrecker. He gave a post-election commitment on this. He's now gone back on that, so close to Parliament resuming next week. He is completely wanting to destabilise things, and he really... As an opposition leader now, he just needs to get on with the job. As an opposition leader, let the government get on with theirs.
Annabel, with the development,
job.
Annabel, with the developments today, does that mean we're now likely to see Harry Jenkins in the chair next Tuesday?
Wow,
smashing the gavel.
I suspect the kind of gloves are off here. I mean, if I were Julia Gillard, I'd be ringing around the coalition backbench looking for somebody who was demoted recently in the reshuffle or overlooked, and looking for a nice office in the House of Reps wing, because that is a nice office.
Is that a possibility?
Well, look, it'd be amazing.
Because Tony Abbott would wreck that person's career if they took it up, wouldn't he?
Well, that's why you need to look for somebody whose career's already been wrecked. That's always the great
Julia
place
Gillard,
to
capitalising on wreckers.
I think that this is... what's happened today is pretty significant in predicting the way this Parliament is going to work. It is going to be scratchy.
Yeah.
It is going to be hostile as a result of this decision. It is going to be very, very hard for any coalition MP to get a pair from now on. I mean...
It sure will be.
Wait, if you're a coalition MP with a school speech night to go to, forget about it.
Forget about it. Well, new Climate Change Minister Greg Combet has put a carbon tax firmly back on the agenda. He's made it clear that that's one of the policy options to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
The political reality in the formation of the government, the circumstances are a bit different than we anticipated, and it does mean that alternative policy options will come onto the table. We will be looking at the various options for the development of a carbon price, as I said, and we'll thoroughly subject them to proper evaluation. But at the end of the day, the mechanism is one thing. The important thing is that we make the economic reform, because our economy needs this.
Now, not surprisingly, the opposition has leapt on his comments, accusing the government of breaking an election campaign promise. Shadow Climate Change Minister Greg Hunt says the tax would hurt Australian families.
It does two things. One is it says our election eve fundamental bedrock pitch to Australia meant nothing. And secondly, it says that electricity pricing is the government's preferred means of hurting middle Australia.
Now, Cate, Greg Combet didn't seem completely comfortable raising that issue of a carbon tax there, but you must be, the Greens must be happy with this kind of talk, at least it being on the table.
Absolutely. I mean, this is part of the agreement between Labor and the Greens, setting up a climate change committee and looking at a carbon tax. Now, it's disappointing that the opposition has not agreed so far to come into that climate change committee and to look at establishing a carbon tax. Hopefully the opposition will come on board. Clearly, with the carbon tax, the opposition needs to recognise, I think, that they've lost this debate. When we've got the head of BP coming out and supporting a carbon tax, that is extremely significant in this country. And I think, you know, the community is moving with that. The community is accepting that. They still want action on climate change. And let's hope that someone from the opposition will come on board and try and make it work.
Chris Berg, what did you make of Greg Combet saying it's certainly on the table at least?
Well, I mean, it's obviously on the table. I think ever since we found out, you know, the final tally at the election that climate change was going to be the policy preference that Julia Gillard is going to try to make this term all about. She needs a big win, and climate change is the obvious one, just looking at who the independents are and, of course, Adam Bandt in the House. But that doesn't mean it's going to be politically successful in the long term. And a lot of people have said, you know, there's a overwhelming consensus in the Australian community that we should have a price on carbon. That's undoubtedly true. But there's not an overwhelming consensus that individuals should be paying a price on carbon. And that's when it's going to start to really bite. We've just seen this week, in fact, yesterday, we saw reports about the projected price of electricity. People's electricity bills are going to double in the next few years. I think once that starts hitting consumers, then the government's going to be in real trouble. I think Julia Gillard has to get something up on climate change, but she can't get very much up without getting in a lot of trouble from the coalition. And we know, after all, that in every election, the cost of living is a big issue. It's going to just get bigger after a carbon tax.
Cate, Chris has got a good point there, doesn't he? I mean, this thing that we're hearing, bill shock, already people are complaining about how large their bills are now, particularly pensioners and people on low incomes. That's going to be a very difficult thing for Labor or the Greens to sell.
How a carbon tax impacts on low-income households is a very important thing for this committee to tackle, absolutely. You need to look at the extraordinary amount of subsidies that are currently going into the fossil fuel industry. Look at the extraordinary amount of money that was going to go to the polluting companies under the CPRS. Now, with something like a carbon tax, of course, low-income households will need to be subsidised to ensure that they can pay their bills. But we are going to see bills rise. We are going to see householders having to save energy as a result. I mean, this is life under climate change. This is life under weaning ourselves off fossil fuels is actually making that more expensive. But the government has to be receptive so that people come on board, and we don't want people being unable to pay their bills, of course not.
Annabel, a lot of people are coming out in favour of carbon tax. We've had Marius Kloppers from BHP. Andrew Forrest this week said he'd prefer that to an ETS. The Greens are supportive of it. If so many people are supporting it and it's a policy worth considering, why did Julia Gillard rule it out at the last election?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I was surprised when she did that because, I mean, for all of this talk now of changed circumstances and it's all terribly different now and so we take a different approach, I mean, it's not really with respect to the Prime Minister because we always knew that the government would be dealing with a Greens-dominated Senate for the large part of this term. We know what the Greens' view of the ETS that was proposed in an amended form in the end by the government.